Mm-hmm. Okay, so welcome everyone. We are now online, we're live finally, despite many technical difficulties. And throughout all the days of the conference, throughout the weekend, we will have this studio meetings when I will talk more about the program and all the attractions that we've prepared for you. But right now we're way over time on this, so let's get to the point and let's allow Dr. Richard Knapek from the University of Silesia to welcome us, and then we'll go to our first guest, Matija Jelaska. Thank you. So, Dr. Knapek. Yeah, but it's okay. It's the way it's supposed to be. We're streaming to YouTube.
This conference to figure it out. So, few last words will be most important. I'd like to assure you, in this horrible world, there are heroes. I am really impressed with the work they done in organizing this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, they put their hearts and other parts of their flesh to make this meeting a great opportunity for developing research in culture, in philosophy, and other disciplines. So now, prepare your mouses, prepare your touchpads, find this little button called reaction, and put as much hearts, likes, and everything else, which is virtual bravo for the organizers of this great conference. Thank you, and have a great few days of horror in metaphysics. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much as well. And enjoy your weekend. We hope you can join us again as a viewer. Okay, so I think we can get to the point, Matija.
Mateusz, you are mute.
Sorry, it's already been a long day, and I'm not.
It's just beginning.
Yeah, it is. It is. The conference beginning, but we've had technical difficulties for like 3 hours or so, and it's taken a toll on me. So, not to drag on, let's start with introducing you. Am I pronouncing your name right? Matija Jelacha?
Yes, yes,
Okay, great. So you're from Croatia,
yes.
and today you will tell us about some exciting perspectives on Cthulhu and the title is On the Horror of Knowledge, H.P. Lovecraft and Speculative Realism.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. The next talk will be on structural realism. It might intersect in an interesting way. We'll see. And of course, after you and the other guests have your own discussion, we will welcome St. Joshi. So attractions are coming in heaps.
Yes.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you. If the sound is too weak or if it's too strong, please do tell me about it. I will. I can never speak if I have all of you on my screen. So I always minimize, and I won't be able to see you. If you do anything, I won't be able to see you. But please speak up if anything is wrong.
I will definitely remind you when you're near the time limit.
Yes. I've typed my. Yes. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, thank you.
I've timed my presentation, so I'll begin. So first of all, of course, let me just see. Yes. First of all, I have to thank the organizers for inviting me to this truly unique event, and for giving me the privilege to open this event. As I said, this is truly a unique event. At least I have never heard of anything like it, primarily because it has dual nature. On the one hand, it is an academic conference, a philosophy conference, a pop culture conference. But on the other, it is also a fan convention, a convention of Lovecraft's fans. And I think that this dual nature of this conference fits Lovecraft's work perfectly. For, as we all know, Lovecraft's work has the longest time existed primarily or almost exclusively in the realm of popular culture. And it's only in the last couple of decades that he has been gaining more and more traction in the academic world, in the philosophy world in particular as well. In this talk, I will in fact focus precisely on the significance that Lovecraft's work has had for a group of philosophers originally gathered under the name of speculative realism some 15 years ago. Before I begin, I have to confess two things. First of all, that I had my COVID shot today. So if I begin to speak in tongues, it's not because the great old ones have taken my body, have overtaken my body or something like that, but it's merely due to the COVID vaccine. And the other confession I have to make is that I wasn't truly into Lovecraft before discovering speculative realism. It was precisely speculative realism that led me to Lovecraft. I was never really a fan of horror fiction, neither of a fan of genre fiction in general, neither of horror nor of SF. But again, because of speculative realism, I really started to appreciate Lovecraft's work. But Lovecraft truly is a unique case, for he can be read both as a fiction writer and as a philosopher. It could even be argued that Lovecraft is one of the best writers among philosophers and one of the best philosophers amongst writers. I will begin this talk with a brief introduction of speculative realism. So, it has been on the scene for at least 15 years, and I assume that we are all pretty much familiar with its main themes, its main figures, its main ideas, and so on. But given that this conference is geared in part towards non-academic audiences, and that we do come from different backgrounds, I think a general introduction to speculative realism is warranted. So, in the beginning, speculative realism was merely a name of a one-day workshop held at Goldsmiths College, London, in 2007. Only 4 philosophers participated in this event. They were Ray Brassier, who organized the event together with Alberto Toscano, Kentan Measu, Graham Harman, and Ian Hamilton Grant. The term speculative realism was chosen merely as a compromise umbrella term, with which all the 4 participants could agree upon, but none of them actually identified with it. What initially brought these 4 philosophers together was their shared rejection of what Kentan Measu named correlationism. And I will read from Measu's book, After Finitude, published in 2006 and translated in 2008, his definition of correlationism. So, I quote, "The central notion of modern philosophy since Kant seems to be that of correlation. By correlation, we mean the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. We will henceforth call correlationism any current of thought which maintains the unsurpassable character of the correlation so defined." Besides their shared rejection of correlationism, there was only one other thing these 4 philosophers had in common. And Graham Harman was the first to explicitly highlight this. I quote, "Also, I think there are some crucial commitments which Measu and Brassier share, which in turn, also, I think there are some crucial commitments which Measu and Brassier share, which in turn, also, so I think it would be counterproductive to try and square all of them together." So let me just briefly highlight these crucial similarities between Measu and Brassier. First of all, Brassier certainly shares Measu's account of correlationism. For both of them, all philosophy after Kant is correlationist. That is, based on the idea that it is not possible to think being and thought apart from each other, but only in correlation. However, it is crucial to emphasize that Measu and Brassier also agree on the causes of such a state of post-Kantian philosophy. Namely, they both hold that correlationism is a consequence of the inability of philosophy to confront the challenge placed before it by the advances of modern natural sciences. For Measu, the true meaning of the Galilean Copernican revolution in science consists, I quote, "in the paradoxical unveiling of thought's capacity to think what there is, whether thought exists or not. That is, it consists, I quote again, in the thought of thought's contingency for the world, and the recognition that thought has become able to think a world that can dispense with thought, a world that is essentially unaffected by whether or not anyone thinks it. The confrontation with such a notion of the contingency of thought instills in humanity's conception of itself and the cosmos," this is again a quote from Measu, "a sense of desolation and abandonment." In a similar fashion, for Brassier, a crucial aspect of the advance of modern science is the process of the disenchantment of the world. I must stress before I continue that this account of Brassier that I'm presenting here is 15 years old. It is basically it is based on his book Nihil Unbound, and Brassier has moved significantly away from this stage of his work, but these are the ideas that he expounds in this book in his first and for now the only book that he has published thus far. For Brassier, a crucial aspect of the advance of modern science is the process of the disenchantment of the world. From the Copernican revolution in astronomy and Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection in biology, all the way to contemporary discoveries in the realm of cognitive neuroscience, each significant advance in modern sciences brought into question certain essential notions of humanity's common sense conception of the world and of its position in it. Such disenchantment, holds Brassier, constitutes a trauma for humanity's conception of itself and the world, and instills in it a sense of horror. So these two terms, trauma and horror, are derived from Brassier's work. So for both Meillassoux and Brassier, post-Kantian correlationism is nothing but an attempt of philosophy to evade the confrontation with this traumatic and horrifying account of the world which modern science articulates. A world independent from and indifferent to human thought and existence. Accordingly, for both Meillassoux and Brassier, the critique of correlationism and the affirmation of thought's ability to think the world as independent from and indifferent to human thought is the main task of contemporary philosophy. Of course, where Meillassoux and Brassier differ is in their respective accounts of how to achieve this formidable task. But there is one last thing that their projects have in common, even in this respect. Namely, they both find crucial conceptual resources to articulate their respective accounts of an escape from the correlationist circle in insights provided by the natural sciences. In Meillassoux' argumentation, the pride of place belongs to ancestral statements, which are geological statements about a time before the advent of life and thought on Earth. Brassier, on the other hand, devises the resources of physics in order to articulate the concept of extinction, which indexes a future point in time after the very possibility of thought, life, and embodiment itself. For anyone even remotely familiar with Lovecraft, even this brief and rough sketch of Meillassoux' and Brassier's ideas should suffice to see the many important convergences between them and Lovecraft's worldview and his weird fiction. But let me make these similarities explicit. I'll first focus briefly on Lovecraft in order to highlight some important aspects of his work that will be crucial for my later comparison. The most fundamental principle of Lovecraft's work and thought in general, both of his philosophy and of his fiction, is expressed by the famous opening words of his essay Supernatural Horror in Literature. I quote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Everything else in Lovecraft follows from this simple principle. In fact, it could be argued that all other Lovecraft's articulations, both of his conception of weird fiction or simply the weird, are nothing but more elaborate versions of this same thought. For instance, in Notes on Writing Weird Fiction, Lovecraft states the following, I quote, "I wanted to achieve momentarily the illusion of some strange suspension or violation of the galling limitations of time, space, and natural law, which forever imprison us and frustrate our curiosity about the infinite cosmic spaces beyond the radius of our sight and analysis. These stories frequently emphasize the element of horror because fear is our deepest and strongest emotion, and the one which best lends itself to the creation of nature-defying illusions. Horror and the unknown or the strange are always closely connected, so that it is hard to create a convincing picture of shattered natural law or cosmic alienage or outsideness without laying stress on the emotion of fear. However, if our picture of Lovecraft's conception of the weird is to be complete, one more detail has to be added. Weird for Lovecraft is synonymous not only with the unknown, but also with the unknowable, that which cannot be known, the impossible or the inconceivable. As Lovecraft simply states on another occasion, I quote, "The crux of a weird tale is something which could not possibly happen." However, while these quotes do clearly confirm that Lovecraft's conception of weird fiction rests on an inextricable link between the unknown, the unknowable, the impossible on the one hand, and fear or horror on the other, what we have yet to explicate is the origin of this emotion of fear or horror. In order to do that, it is necessary to quote extensively from Lovecraft's short essay, Time and Space. This essay provides the most perfect and the most beautiful expression of Lovecraft's cosmicism. And it is precisely due to, and I must confess that it's precisely due to such places in Lovecraft's work that I love him so much. So I quote from Time and Space. "Of the various conceptions brought before the human mind by the advance of science, what can be compared in strangeness and magnitude with that of eternity and infinity as presented by modern astronomy?" Can I continue, or is there some problems?
Yes, please go on. It's about the other channel.
Oh, sorry. So, of the various conceptions brought before the human mind by the advance of science, what can be compared in strangeness and magnitude with that of eternity and infinity, as presented by modern astronomy? Nothing more deeply disturbs our subtle egotism and self-importance than the realization of man's utter insignificance, which comes with knowledge of his position in time and space. Life, or at least life upon the Earth and the other planets of the solar system, extends but a little distance, relatively speaking, into the past. Nor is the future prospect of much greater extent. In a few billion years, a mere second in eternity, the sun and planets must lose the heat bequeathed to them by the parent nebula and roll back, frozen and untenanted through space. Therefore, the very existence of life and thought is but a matter of a moment in unbounded time, the merest incident in the history of the universe. An hour ago we did not exist, in another hour we shall have ceased to be. Turning to the consideration of infinite space, we are no less paralyzed with thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls. In our own solar system, we discover the apparently boundless Earth to be a comparatively small planet. And in the immediate universe, we find the entire solar system but an inconsequential molecule. What then shall we think when we learn that all that universe is but one of an infinite number of similar star clusters, only the nearest of which are to be seen from our part of space? And besides all this, we must ever recall that space has no boundary, that the illimitable reaches of vacancy extend endlessly out beyond our sight or comprehension, perhaps beyond the apparently infinite region of the luminiferous ether and beyond control of the laws of motion and gravitation. What mind can venture to depict these remote realms where form, dimensions, matter, and energy may all be subject to undreamt of modification and grotesque manifestations? All that we know, see, dream, or imagine is less than a grain of dust in infinity. What this quote reveals is that for Lovecraft, cosmic horror is actually a consequence of the scientific knowledge about the nature of time and space. As I said earlier, so again, I quote from Lovecraft, "Nothing more deeply disturbs our settled egotism and self-importance than the realization of man's utter insignificance, which comes with knowledge of his position in time and space." Furthermore, Lovecraft claims that when confronted with these thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls, we are paralyzed by fear. Paralyzing fear is therefore for Lovecraft the only appropriate reaction to humanity's awareness of its utter insignificance in relation to the infinity of time and space. What needs to be emphasized here is that there is clearly a paradox at the heart of Lovecraft's conception. Namely, his cosmic horror, or the fear of the unknown, is actually a consequence of the known, of what is known. That is, of the knowledge of the world and our place within it that is revealed by the advances of modern sciences. So it was precisely the natural sciences that confronted humankind with its constitutive, cognitive, and physical limitations. And it is precisely by an encounter with the impossible, the unknown, unknowable, inconceivable phenomena that humanity becomes aware of its constitutive limitations, which in turn instills in it the sense of fear or horror, cosmic horror to be more precise. The similarities of Lovecraft's conception of cosmic horror to Meillassoux and Brassier's philosophical projects are pretty obvious. It's actually hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. Let me just briefly summarize them. So, at the basis of Lovecraft's cosmic horror is the very same idea which is also at the center of Meillassoux and Brassier's philosophical projects. The idea of a world independent from and indifferent to human thought and existence. Furthermore, just like Meillassoux and Brassier, Lovecraft sees the source of this idea in the advances of modern natural sciences, amongst other in astronomy and physical knowledge and physics knowledge of the infinite realms of time and space, in relation to which humanity is an utterly insignificant thing. Finally, for all three of them, the confrontation with such knowledge instills in humanity a sense of fear or horror. It could thereby be concluded that Lovecraft's significance for Meillassoux and Brassier lies in the fact that his weird fiction constitutes a literary articulation of the very same problematic nexus which these two philosophers postulate as the fundamental challenge to contemporary philosophy. However, this is not all there is to Lovecraft's relation to Meillassoux and Brassier. There is one other crucial aspect, both of Lovecraft's and their work, that has still remained in the shadows. Let me first focus again on Meillassoux and Brassier. So there is a strong dividing line between the two of them and the post-structuralist correlationist thought on the one hand and Graham Harman's thought on the other. The reason why the advent of speculative realism was so enthusiastically received in the beginning was not only because of Meillassoux' diagnosis of correlationism, which seemed to perfectly describe the stifling state of philosophy and humanities in the wake of post-structuralism, but even more so, what felt is truly liberating about Meillassoux' and Brassier's thought was their more or less explicit promise that the correlational circle could be broken out of, and that knowledge of the world in itself was indeed possible. For me, this was always the great dividing line, as I said, between philosophy before and after speculative realism. The question of the possibility of knowledge of the in itself was always at the center of continental philosophy. But whereas most continental philosophy followed Kant's lead and answered this question in the negative, speculative realism was seen as opening an alternative and affirmative path. Lee Braver has, for the last couple of years, been developing a reading of the history of continental philosophy along these very lines. In his reading, at the heart of continental philosophy has always been the idea of thinking the unthinkable, grasping the ungraspable, or experiencing the impossible. Kant was again the one to have formulated this idea first. As is well known, Kant instituted a distinction between knowledge and thought. We cannot know that in itself, but we can think it. This distinction is crucial for Kant's system as a whole, and in particular for his account of the sublime. In Kant, the sublime denotes an encounter with phenomena which by their magnitude or power transcend our cognitive and physical faculties, thereby making us feel small and weak in comparison. However, while these phenomena transcend our faculty of knowledge, of understanding and sensibility, our faculty of thought, that is reason, transcends them as natural phenomena in turn. This is why, after an initial feeling of pain and or fear, the encounter with the sublime phenomena instills in us a sense of pleasure. According to Jean-François Lyotard, I quote, the aesthetic of the sublime is where modern art, including literature, finds its impetus and where the logic of the avant-garde finds its axioms. As Lyotard further clarifies, the feeling of the sublime results from the conflict between the faculty to conceive of something or reason and the faculty to present something or imagination. We can conceive of the absolutely great, the absolutely powerful, but any presentation of such an object appears sadly lacking to us. These ideas, for which there is no possible presentation and which therefore provide no knowledge of reality, Lyotard calls unpresentable. In light of this, Lyotard argues that the essence of modern art consists in an attempt to, I quote, present the existence of something unpresentable, showing that there is something we can conceive of which we can neither see nor show. This is the stake of modern painting. Lyotard further elaborates on this by claiming that in the case of painting, it will evidently present something but negatively. It will therefore avoid figuration or representation. It will be blank like one of Malevich's squares. With regard to literature, Lyotard names Proust and Joyce as examples of the aesthetic of sublime. I quote, the works of Proust and Joyce both allude to something that does not let itself be made present. In Proust, the thing that is alluded is the identity of consciousness, while in Joyce, it is the identity of writing itself. Ironically, I now finally return to Lovecraft. Ironically, it was precisely Lovecraft's rejection of the postulates of modernist literature, as described here, that made him the hero of speculative realist philosophers. But let me just briefly explain. Justin Meillassoux and Brassier believe, contra correlationism, that philosophy can in fact provide an account of the world in itself. So Lovecraft believed, contra the greats of modernist literature, that the art of literature can in fact provide a literary articulation of the horrifying encounter with impossible phenomena. In fact, it could be argued that Lovecraft maintained that the primary task of literature and the arts in general was precisely to assuage our frustration with our cognitive limitations and satisfy our curiosity with what lies beyond or the unknown. The best expression of this view is found in a letter to his friend Frank Belknap Long. A great part of religion is I quote from this letter, a great part of religion is merely a childish and diluted pseudo-gratification of this perpetual knowing toward the ultimate illimitable void. Superadded to this simple curiosity is the galling sense of the intolerable restraint which all sensitive people feel as they survey their natural limitations in time and space, is scaled against the freedom and expansions and comprehensions and adventurous expectancies which the mind can formulate as abstract conceptions. Only a perfect cloud can fail to discern these irritant feelings in the greater part of mankind. Feelings so potent and imperious that, if denied symbolic outlets in aesthetics or religious fakery, they produce actual hallucinations of the supernatural and drive half-responsible minds to the concoctions of the most absurd hoaxes and the perpetuation of the most absurd specific myth types. Let me end this talk with one last quote from Lovecraft, one which actually perfectly encapsulates everything I've been speaking about. In fact, my talk would have been much better, much more beautiful and precise, and needless to say, shorter, if I had simply decided to just read this quote. It is, of course, the opening paragraph of the Call of Cthulhu. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hit here too harmless little. But someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
A great presentation. A lot of information though, so I think some explanations will be in order during the discussion, especially for the fans and not the philosophers. But we'll talk about it in a minute. And now let's go to Leonardo Arradiada Beltran.
Perfect.
You're from Chile, right? But you're
Yeah.
a representative of the University of Groningen.
Yeah, I'm here in the Netherlands right now, yeah.
Okay, great. So you're going to tell us about ontic structural realism in the works of Lovecraft.
Yeah. In fact, it's a pretty good thing having this Matija excellent presentation before me, because it's the same line of thought, I think. So yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion at the end of my talk, I hope.
Okay, I have a feeling I leave the discussion to you too, because...
Yeah.
Okay, so you may start if you're ready.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I'm pretty eager to show my work in front of the fans and in front of the philosophers. You are doing a marvelous work. You have ST Yoshi, so it's going to be a unique opportunity to discuss about Lovecraft. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, I'm going to start. I want to show some slides. Perfect. Well, ontic structural realism in the work of H.P. Lovecraft. Well, I think it's appropriate to begin this talk with justifying, however briefly, the use or abuse that I am going to make of the H.P. Lovecraft literature to illustrate this philosophical speculation in the following slides. That is so, for it would seem that philosophy has this habit to visiting other disciplines and intruding on them as a not always welcome guest. This justification becomes even more necessary if we aspire to deal with one of the most significant philosophical questions, namely the answer to the ontological what exists. So, as Matija said, the recurrence of philosophy to literature has its antecedents in the exaltation of Hölderlin and Bataille by German and French philosophy in the 20th century. This is affirmed by the philosopher Fabián Ludueña in his book H.P. Lovecraft, La disyunción en el ser, is sadly only in Spanish. Ludueña considered that in the present age, Lovecraft is the author best suited to identify the horizon against which all current philosophizing must measure itself to aspire to remain in the existence of thinking. Also, the philosopher Graham Harman, also mentioned by Matija, points out that Lovecraft will be the raw material in the analysis of his speculative philosophy. This is exaltation of a work that is often considered as a pulp. So, in Harman's great realist Lovecraft philosophy, we can find an illustration of his object-oriented philosophy, object-oriented ontology philosophy through the H.P. literature. That said, let us see what aspect of Lovecraft literature allow us, and Ludueña and Graham Harman mostly, to consider Lovecraft the Hölderlin of our times. Cosmic horror and the greatest fear. In his essay Supernatural Horror Literature, Lovecraft states that the fear of the unknown is the oldest and the strongest emotion. Yeah, we can agree on that. So, Therefore, a good fantasy writing must appeal to produce this strangeness and this surprise in the reader, triggering the fear of the unknown. That is why in horror literature it's common to alter the common routines. So you got monsters, you got murderers, you got some things that is outside your common routine. However, this form of surprise is basic because the entity that produces fear is easily identifiable. If I see a monster, that monster is what is frightening me. If I see a murderer, is that murderer what is frightening me? Lovecraft aims to do something more complex. He expects to provoke fear, but in a sense of strangeness based on an overflow of the perceptual capacities of his characters, and of us, or of the readers too. In Lovecraft's literature, it's common to find situations in where the character perceives that something is frightening them, but they cannot define what it is. What is frightening me? I cannot define what is frightening me. If we follow a Heideggerian categorization, the affective disposition involved here is not fear, but angst. Fear is always assignable to a given entity. So you can get in the picture that swimmer is going to be to feel fear because he's seeing the shark. But angst is something different. Frighten us without identifying the source of this dread. You cannot find the entity that is provoking you this sensation of fear. So I postulate that the atmosphere of Lovecraft seeks to create is based on angst. Examples of this distressing situation will be the architecture with angles for more than 3 dimensions, or a clock that indicates a non-linear time. We can find such cases in the Lovecraft literature, specifically in the Dreams in the Witch House and in the wonderful Through the Gates of the Silver Key. I insist that our perception cannot respond to either of these two situations as we move in a 3-dimensional space and in a linear time. So, how does this literary style relate to ontology? To do so, I think we must replace the ontological question, what exists, with the literary question, what frightens me? That is the question that the characters in the Lovecraft stories have. Well, ontological formulation of what frightens me. In everyday routine, no one in the right mind questions what exists. Since Kantian phenomenology, we human beings seem capable to perceiving the world through sensibility and understanding. As I stated in the previous point, a person who sees a shark approaching him should be feel fear, and that fear is oriented to, that fear will orient his perception towards the shark, identifying it as the source of that fright. The search of the origin of the frightened is successful. You can see it's the shark. The shark is what is frightening me. There is no motivation then to ask what exists, because I always check what I perceive is what exists. Now, this situation explains relatively well those fears that are the most commonplace. However, the dread that Lovecraft wants to provoke is something much more elevated. The affective environment that Lovecraft constructs overwhelms our perception. What frightens us is not an entity of this world. Not surprisingly, many stories occur in an uninhabited landscape, such as Antarctic environments of high-altitude peaks. These places suggest the non-existence of the entity that frightens us. What is frightening me? There is nothing. How is possible this is nothing is frightening me? In my view, Lovecraft guides us to think about the question of what exists. If we experience dread, then it's something must be provoked that dread. What entity is frightening me? Well, fright of something outside the human perceptual field. How is something outside the perceptual field in a story? I will propose that Lovecraft used these stylistic strategies. Let us briefly review 2 of them, the saturation of qualifications and the suspension of the law of nature. The saturation of qualifications can be seen among other texts in the Call of Cthulhu. In this story, the character found a strange kind of statue, indecipherable object. In this case, the human perceptions try to unsuccessfully to form a correspondence between the observer and some predicate that can determine the observer. So, I read Lovecraft. It seemed to be a sort of a monster or a symbol representing a monster, or a formula which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yelled simultaneous picture of an octopus, a dragon, a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy tentacled head surmounting a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. But it was the general outline of the whole which made me most strongly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a secret plan architectural background. Well, you can see that there is no appropriate adjective for the statue, for the thing. So multiple qualifications attempt to describe without success. This produced a sense of inferiority. I am not capable of describing the thing. In Lovecraft stories, it becomes clear that human perception is incapable of accounting these such entities that is frighten us. For its part, the suspension of the law of nature calls into question our four-dimensional extent. Lovecraft tries to show his character inhabiting the three spatial dimensions and a linear temporal dimension is not necessarily the reflection of the totality of the reality. It's just a shadow of the total of the reality. So, how can we surpass this human perceptual field? Here's where I'm going to start to use the idea of the multiple of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. What is the proper way to overcome the four-dimensionality perception? In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari proposed that the multiple must be made, not by always adding a higher dimension, but rather in the simplest of ways, by a team of sovereignty, with the number of dimensions one already has available, always minus one. The only way the ones belong to the multiple, always subtract. Subtract the unique form, the multiplicity to be considered. Right at n-1 dimensions, a system of this kind is called we call a rhizome. That is Deleuze and Guattari and 1,000 Plateaus. Well, in my opinion, this construction of this multiple erases the human perception dimensional limits. That is to say, as far the spatial dimension is concerned, in the sense of adding a fourth spatial dimension, because we live in the three-dimensional space, so our now height, length, and width will remove this restriction through subtraction. So there is no more width, and there is no more length, and finally there is no more height. So we started with the 3 dimension, and we ended with 1 dimension, but with no differentiation. So this 1 dimension is more complete, and this 1 dimension is what I think Deleuze and Spinoza is called the multiple, because you have all the other dimensions. And at the start, you have only 3. For the temporal dimension, an analogous processes must be executed, but in this case, because the temporal dimension is a vector, you have to normalize that vector. But that division is in the end is also a subtraction. So the idea of the subtraction that Spinoza that Deleuze and Guattari is saying is analogous. So, to understand this multiple concept in the 1,000 Plateaus, I propose to see the concept of individual that Deleuze has in mind in his book En Medio de Spinoza. So, Deleuze says, the individual is the relationship. It seems to me that it's perhaps one of the first times in the history of the individual that an attempt to think the relationships in its pure states is going to be outlined. What does the relationship mean in its pure state? It is possible in a certain way to think the relationship independently of these terms. what does this relationship mean independent of the terms? Well, Deleuze is thinking here in a relation in the spirit state. Is obviously thinking in the calculus, in the differential calculus, when you have this study of the infinite, but it's not the important is not the items that are related, but the relation itself. I think Deleuze is thinking it's a system of relations. We have already said that constructing this multiple is a subtraction that confuses all the dimensions in one. So when you got this confusion, you lose your center because everything is the same. In this loss of center gives the confusion because it forbids any hierarchy. You don't have any dimension over the other. It's all the same. It's an horizon. The head is the direct, and this is pretty different. We can usually think using the notion of the individual, because we can distinguish normally this idea of individual with organs and with functions. We can see we humans have a head, but it's in the function of the director, and we have also a series of structures that fulfill a specific function. We have lungs intrinsically designed to breathe. We have a stomach intrinsically designed to digest, and so on. By contrast, Deleuze and Guattari, in this manifold, there is no hierarchy. So the individual is the relationship, and the components of this relationship can occupy any position, and according to that position, they determine one individuality or another. So the characteristics are only extrinsical. This is easy to figure out if we think in numbers. For example, in the number 3 is less than the number 4, but the same number 3 is greater than the number 2. So I mean that unlike the organ, like the lung, intrinsically designed to respiration, the number 3 does not intrinsically have the quality to be being greater than or lesser than another number. It's only in the relation when these characteristics appear. Now, if the individual is the relationship, what are the components of this relationship? For Spinoza, each individual has an infinity of extensive parts, and Spinoza called this the simple bodies. And these simple bodies have two characteristics. They are collective, they are an infinitude, and they have only extrinsic properties. They have anything intrinsically. It's only extrinsically. Only after the relation, they got his characteristics. So, concerning collectivity, we have that an individual is an infinite collection of simple bodies in a specific structure. Since this relationship is not hierarchical, simple bodies could be related in any other structure. They must be, for each individual, is capable to be an infinite relational structure. On the other hand, the relationship between the simple bodies are only extrinsic, since they are born only after to be in this particular structure. Therefore, an individual is only an actualization of the infinite relationship of its simple bodies. Thus, what defines an individual is its structure, nothing intrinsically, only the form, the relation, the structure. This open a window to think in the end of the individual in the usual way we think. If what defines the individual is a structure, we can venture to say that the only thing that exists is the structure. In my proposal here is to connect this idea with a type of philosophical materialism called the ontic structural realism, the OSR. What does the OSR propose? The philosopher Bruno Borghi mentioned that OSR states that the ontology of the physical world must be reconceived in such a way that the pure structure are its basic entities. Pure structure. Objects and properties should be eliminated in favor of the structures. However, it advocates that claim that such a pure structure must to be capable of accounting for the physical reality. So the OSRs propose to forget the notion of the individual and to remain with the structure alone. Let us suppose this idea is correct. If all can I know is a structure, we must have a structure of what? Because we need something that has no intrinsic qualities, only extrinsic. So Spinoza had proposed that it's a structure of simple bodies, but that is an idea. What entities in real life can form this non-hierarchical relationship of simple abstract bodies? Well, the cosmologist Max Tegmark defines a mathematical structure as a set of abstract entities with relationships between them. Any other type of structure will be composed of non-abstract entities, so they cannot be simple bodies. Therefore, what I'm proposing here is that the Luz and Guattari's multiple can be think as a mathematical structure. In 1,000 Plateaus, they escape from the word structure because they are afraid of it can be confused with a hierarchy. Where there is a hierarchy, we have intrinsic characteristics, and we have organs, and we have this body with organs, usual notion of the individual. However, a mathematical structure, by definition, is not hierarchical. Is commonly known in mathematical as a graph. Well, it's now appropriate return to the question that began this talk. What frightens me? Lovecraft characters' angst have no explication into the human perception. That dread is something infinitely multidimensional, is outside our perception. So to understand that infinity, we or the characters or with the readers must abandon the idea of the individual and attend to the structure, to the idea of the multiple. So what's frightening me is a particular structure. And in this structure, and as I said before, is a structure in a mathematical idea of the composition of a structure. So we are part of the same structure that is frightening me, because all in this way of ontologic structural realism is a mathematical structure. We are a mathematical structure. What frightens me is a mathematical structure. My three-dimensional way of view the space is a mathematical structure, but also everything else is a mathematical structure too. So what frightens me is a part of the simple bodies of this mathematical structure that I'm also part. So it's an actualization of what I can call an individual, only in a different arrangement. This is why an adage of the Migo monk says to create fear, call up a mirror, because what is fear is what is frightening me is also myself, but in a different actualization. In the story of the Mountain of Madness, the Migo are described as made of a substance from outside the known time and space continuum. I dare to speculate that the Migo would be this mathematical structure, this infinite multiplicities. So, in conclusion, well, in this talk, it was intended to show that through Lovecraft's work it's possible to illustrate a form of ontologic structural reality. It was postulated that Lovecraft's literature makes it possible to exemplify an ontology oriented toward relationships and not toward entities. Furthermore, since it's a form of OSR, the entities are defined by the relationships only having extrinsic characteristics. So, thank you very much. I'm eager to discuss this presentation.
Thank you, Leonardo. It was very interesting. And I think that before I start with my own questions or ones from the audience, you have the opportunity to ask one another about your presentations. So, do you have any questions for your compatriots?
Yeah, can I start?
Yes, of course.
Matei, thank you for your presentation. I think we can perfectly complement these two talks. I found especially interesting this idea of the sublime, the content sublime. And if I remember well, there is a two kind of sublime. One is the sublime of the mathematics, another is I forgot the other kind of sublime. And this kind of sublime of the mathematics can be in any way related to this idea of the reality is in the end a mathematical structure in where are all the same and where there's no hierarchy, only relation that can configure one space, one individual or another. There is a possible link in this sublime mathematical with the idea of the Kantian philosophy and the idea of this French philosophy with the Deleuze reading Spinoza. Is that possible? Is that doable?
Yes, of course. So the sublime, in Kant, there is the mathematical sublime and the dynamical sublime. And the mathematical sublime simply denotes that which is in spatial terms too big for our imagination to comprehend all at once. So when you're at the bottom of a mountain, you look up and you simply cannot comprehend the entirety of the mountain in one comprehension. You cannot form a single intuition of it all. And for these cases, Kant uses the term mathematical sublime. And the dynamical sublime is he uses in the case when there is some force that is so intense, so strong that it overwhelms the viewer. So when you're standing on the shore and there is on the shore of the sea and there is a great storm in the distance and you witness it and you simply feel this sense of the dynamical sublime because you are frightened of its power, of its force. And the relation between the sublime and French philosophy, they're basically one and the same. if you want to know my thought, because it seems pretty obvious that the analytic continental split in philosophy basically comes from it could be argued that this split between continental and analytic philosophy originates all the way back to the split between Kant's first critique and his third critique. And his third critique, the main notion of his third critique is, of course, the notion of the sublime. And but as I said, Lyotard claims that modernist art is a response to precisely the problem of the sublime and so on. But for me, it seems that the idea of the sublime captures something of the way in which continental philosophy functions as a whole. As I mentioned in my presentation, there is Lee Braver develops this line of thought, this reading of the history of continental philosophy, where the entirety of continental philosophy basically grapples with this question of thinking the unthinkable, of grasping the ungraspable, and so on and so on. And this is pretty much the Kantian problematic. On the one hand, it is the problematic of the first critique, and on the other, it is the problematic of the sublime. But I want to just add one more thing about the sublime with regards to Lovecraft. because I'm very glad that that you mentioned it, because I didn't want to get into that problem during my presentation, because then it would be too long. But there is a great discussion to be had whether Lovecraft's cosmic horror can be construed as an example of the Kantian sublime, because one obvious answer would be that it can be construed in such a way, because just as Kant's sublime denotes all these encounters with those phenomena that transcend our cognitive and our imaginative abilities, this is precisely what Lovecraft stages such encounters in his fiction. But on the other hand, there is also the case to be made, as some theorists argue, that Lovecraft's cosmic horror is not a case of the sublime, precisely because it lacks the positive element that there is in Kant. So in Kant, we are first afraid when we witness something that transcends our cognitive faculties, but we transcend it by way of our reason, our capacity for thought, and in light of this, we feel some pleasure. In Lovecraft, this positive aspect is completely missing. But I nonetheless think that this idea of the sublime, it was made popular, and it was placed at the center of philosophy, of continental philosophy in particular, by Kant. But it is an age-old idea. It is an idea that dates back all the way to ancient Greece, and it just gets reformulated in different manners. And I think that Lovecraft's work definitely presents one new articulation of this age-old idea.
Yeah, wonderful. I maybe this sublime is so overwhelming. There is a link between the study of the sublime and the born of the study of the calculus in mathematics, because the calculus is created to study the infinite also. How you can study the infinite if you can grasp the infinite? So Newton made the calculus, and in the dream of the witch house, the character is studying a way of calculus, a way of a supernatural calculus. It's not the same calculus that we have. It's a calculus that Lovecraft made up for the story. But in this study of this kind of calculus, when you study this infinite, this overwhelming reality, if you are studying the infinite, you need to be the grasping of the infinite is made by dividing the whole by zero. You can divide nothing by zero, but the most close to zero, the concept of the limit in the mathematical way. So you have to have in mind always that the important is not the element in the relation, but the relation itself. That is what a differential calculus are studying. You are more interested in the way that the items are related, but the items itself. So I think that that boom of the study of the infinite you selected in the Lovecraft stories can be illustrate this minution, this sense of inferiority that we humans in a not transcendental state have in front of the reality. I don't know what you think about.
No, it's. I must confess that I'm pretty ignorant of mathematics in general. So when you start talking about math, I can follow to some extent. I can see where you're going and the points you want to make, but it would be hard for me to to contribute in any meaningful way to the discussion. So, but I wanted to ask a question now that you mentioned this Lovecraft story where the character develops some form of calculus. It would be great if we could determine that this kind of calculus is precisely that it corresponds to some manner to the mathematics of the less than what there is 1,000 plateaus. So, have you perhaps been able to establish some similarities between them, or there is none? I guess there is none. So just
yes, there is a link in that story and the concept of the mathematics in 1,000 plateaus. Yeah. I think in that particular story, Lovecraft chose a sense of confidence in the progress of the mathematics and of course in the calculus mostly. But he seems to be positive to the mathematical, to the calculus way of understanding the world, but the Luz and Guattari are pretty much convinced that the mathematical is the way of the knowing the world. I think that the Lovecraft is more prudent in that sense. I have also another question. When you talk about this concept of legion, I also found out that the concept of legion is pretty useful in this way of the simple bodies that Spinoza had, because this legion is an infinitude, is a multitude, is the multiple simple bodies that I want to show in the Spinoza. Spinoza called that the material of pure model is material that is only is material with no intrinsic characteristical, and is multiple, is infinitude, so is in a way can be think as a legion. And the allusions of the Lovecraft in 1,000 plateaus also are connected to the concept of legion. I find that probably can be related with when you're talking, because you also talk about this legion concept.
Legion.
Yeah.
I don't recall mentioning that.
No.
No. It might be some. It might. I think
it's near the end of the talk.
It might be something from Lovecraft's quotes or something, but not as a specific notion that or concept that I use in the interpretation.
Okay. Bueno, but I think that the ultimate legion is the infinite, because greater the legion is more close to the concept of the infinite. I think we can agree on that.
Yes. Yes. Regarding your talk, it was really it was quite. It was quite surprising to me to even see the title of your talk, because the only thing that ontic structural realism, the only thing I know about, I haven't read, I must confess, my ignorance on this account also. The only thing about I know about ontic structural realism, and I hope I'm not wrong even in this case, is James Laidman's book and Dan Ross's book, Everything Must Go.
Yeah,
and this is again through my engagement with Brassier and his work and so on. Is your are your ideas? Is your reading of Lovecraft related to? Can it be related to this book? Also to Laidman's ideas? Is this all a part of ontic structural realism, or?
Yeah. it's all part of the same. I can read these Lovecraft stories, having in mind the Harman background in world philosophy, but Harman is against this way of extreme materialism, because this extreme materialism, when you can say the only a structure exists and the only way that made that structure abstract an abstract relation is in the concept of the mathematical universe. Harman is against that because he is defending his object-oriented ontology, so he claims that the objects really exist. But in this way, I think the rhythm of Lovecraft are more complementary than what Harman is saying with the ontological structural realism, because you can do this operation of subtraction, and you can use this -1. So I'm going to see the world as a Kantian transcendental subject. -1, there is no more subject, there is only objects, and -1, there is no objects, there is only relations. So I think in the final step, you get to the same place. Your final goal is to not limit yourself as putting you in the place of the subject, as putting you in the place of the object. In the idea of Harman, what I think Harman claims is more useful not to see in the subject, but to see in the object, because the object is less biases in order to see the reality. But why to stop there? You can continue this subtraction and eliminate the object, and you can get to the ontic structural realism, where there is no subjects, no entities, there is no objects, and there is only relations. I think it's the same goal.
It's the structures all the way down, as this.
Yeah. It's the structure, not in the way that you can see there is a structure in the way of a body with organs. It is a structure in the way that everything is the same, and you can put the pieces in any place. And if you take one piece and put that piece in another place, you got another individuality. You can use only a set of the pieces. You can use all the pieces. It's only the structure, and all the structure is the same. It's a more horizontal way of thinking. There is nothing better than other. So I think it's a more new way of thinking the reality, only in the relationship. And surprisingly, we got this support of the Max Tegmark, who comes to the mathematics. He has a pretty famous cosmologist, and in his paper, The Mathematical Universe, he totally supports this idea of the world is only mathematics, nothing else. And mathematics, why? Because the mathematics are abstract, only for that.
But what kind of mathematics or mathematical structures does the world consist of? From the little reading I've done of Ladyman's book, Everything Must Go, it seems to me, if I recall correctly, it was a long time ago, that information theory plays a great part in that book. Is it true? And could you please elaborate on this, if you recall that part?
Yeah. What Tegmark says, that way of thinking the mathematical structures is finally appealing to the humans. And the primary hypothesis that there is a world that exists without we humans. The world not need to be thinker, but a subject to exist. Exists a world different than the humans. So that world can be described in terms that no human knowledge. So any information, any cultural background can contaminate that and make a world in the a strict and limited way of thinking of the humans. So there is a mathematical concept that is called the graph. That is only an arrangement in what you have these abstract entities, and if there is a way of describing the universe in these graph terms, that graph must account to the totality of the universe. So you got an isomorphism. What are described is the same what you are describing. So you have a graph that describes the whole universe. The graph is the universe. And the graph, as I said before, is a non-hierarchical mathematical structure. And that is different of the other concept of this mathematical world. This is a mathematical universe, but universe not thinking of universe is a mathematical everything. That is called from, in the usual term, is called the TOT, the theory of everything. Yeah.
One other question, I have only one other question for you, which is unrelated to your presentation, but to your other work. So, if I understood correctly from your short biography, you're doing a PhD or writing a book about computers' capacity to create art.
Yeah. I'm pretty connected with algorithms and with mathematical functions. Yeah. So I'm here in the Netherlands studying the same. This is also a mathematical boost in the artwork. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think I wish Lovecraft can be here present to see these tales that we have computer-generated stories. I'm pretty sure that he can add something to that.
Those stories, if they ever happen, they will truly be horrifying.
No, they already happened. Yeah. I'm working with algorithms with make that kind of stories, and yeah. You got something, a pretty nice story, and you got, in other cases, a pretty horrifying and make you think in the sublime mathematical of infinity. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Matija.
If I might intrude for a moment. Fascinating discussion. I think it could last for an hour more or so. But we have some questions from the audience. There's a few of them, and I don't think we have time for all of them. So let's start with one for Leonardo. Do you think the Lovecraftian perspective of reality is a way to understand the universe from a non-anthropomorphic point of view? You've talked about this already a bit, but maybe if you can say something about a particular story or something like that.
Sorry, I can't get the answer. Can you please read the question again?
Okay. Do you think that the Lovecraftian perspective of reality is a way to understand the universe from a non-anthropomorphic point of view?
Yeah, totally. When you show that the human capabilities are so limited, you are forcing the reader to think there is something more than human, and you can try to see that maybe an alien is more than human, maybe a witch is more than human, and you can make this way through the Lovecraft literature, looking for non-human entities that can see the universe, the reality in different ways. But after you made that way, you can think, maybe that is not more than human, maybe it's just different than human, Yeah, you can think, well, I'm a human, I can see that this kind of reality, this is an alien, this can see this kind of reality, but maybe we can give some interest in the objects, as Herman said. Maybe these objects see the world in different ways. Maybe the other living beings. You can think even in Lovecraft is pretty much in the pulpy, in the octopus, and there is a total actual discussion about this. The octopus is an alien. Why the octopus have 8 brains? I think it's totally make you think in the world in a way that you are not the center. The human is not the center. The human is just you, and there is other, and these other are no minus than you, are no lesser than you, are different. And I think this world keeps appearing different. You can try to erase this limit in what is a human, what is an animal, what is an alien, what is a monster. But all of that limits are human construct. There is no a real limit, I think, in the world of Lovecraft. There is just a continuous. There is just everything is the same, and that I think is a pretty much interesting way to read Lovecraft. Also, if you have in mind all this polemic about the racism in the life of the author, because the stories are making you think that the others are your semihans, and that is totally against the racism, totally against the discrimination. I think it's a pretty encouraging way of reading Lovecraft in the 21st century.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I have a question of my own, or rather a remark, maybe a bit comment on both of you. Mattia, you've mentioned the sublime not having a positive aspect in Lovecraft's writing, but when I heard that, the first thing that came to mind was the quest for unknown Kadat, my favorite Lovecraft story. And in the story, there's this spoiler alert: it's Kadat is Boston, right? But in the character's imagination, it is so beautiful and so perfect that it becomes something completely incomprehensible. So maybe that would be the sublime seen as a positive. And on another thing about Randolph Carter, in the later story, through the gates of the Silver Key, he views his different lives, different bodies and so on, and although, so I think that would be a structure, his different incarnations and so on, but he still has this feeling of being an individual throughout it all, I think. So maybe the mind could be seen as an integrating aspect that makes all the structures an entity, maybe. So I don't know if you want to discuss it together or...
I'll just briefly comment on your comment on the sublime. With Kant, it's merely a terminological issue. So in Kant, this positive element in the sublime consists in humans' awareness that it can transcend with the capacity of thought or reason that which it cannot comprehend with understanding and imagination. So this is the positive. This is why in Kant there is a positive feeling. There is a feeling of pleasure because man is becomes aware of that he transcends by his thought nature. And this example that you mentioned, so there is a positive feeling, but there is also the inability of the human soul. He is of this character. So if I understood correctly, he is confronted with something that is so beautiful that it overwhelms him, and that he is incapable of grasping. So this is a positive feeling, but he is nonetheless still left unable to comprehend. So he still remains at that negative level, as far as I understand the situation.
Yeah, I about the Randolph Carter story. Yeah, I totally agree. When I read Through the Gate of the Silver Key, I see Randolph Carter looking at different kind of structures when he's seeing these different kind of dimensions, different kind of words, different and multiples actualization of himself. And you mentioned that Randolph Carter is still an individual, and how he can be an individual if he is in front of these different kind of actualizations. Well, I think it's for the same. So you can see that different kind of individual, the different kind of structures that are also you, but in a different way, in a different dimension, a different universe, a different time. So if you forgot that you are an individual, you cannot see that. Because if you forgot that you are an individual, if you really overcome this human way of seeing the world, you can to dissolve in this total abstract relation of simple bodies. So in that case, you are seeing all, but you are also seeing nothing. So this maybe you can illustrate this with the composition of music. When you got this scale of the notes from the for composing music, yeah, the sounds are just sounds. It's just one thing, and you artificially make one note, make the C, the D, the E, the F, the G, and so on. But yeah, if you don't make the differentiation, you can't compose the music, because the computer is based in that kind of differentiation. It's the same what Randolph Carter is seeing. Randolph Carter is seeing this different kind of multiple universities, this multiple kind of universe, sorry. But he cannot forget that he's an individual, because in the moment that you forgot that you're an individual, you are nothing. You are confused with this universe that's surrounding you. The only way to see, for us humans, is the human perceptual way to see. We can overcome that. We can think in another ways of thinking, but we cannot actually grasp it. We can think in a hypercube, but we only get the cube. We can think in a cube of six of n dimension, but we cannot see that. We have to embrace our limitations, but having in mind that we are a limited subject that is incapable to know the whole universe, the whole structure that is housing us.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have in this panel, but we will see you again after our talk with Joshi. So thank you very much for your fascinating presentations, and we'll talk again later. Thank you.
Just one question.
Yeah.
we can now disconnect and connect later, or
Yeah,
how?
if that's your preference, it's completely okay.
Yes. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye.
See you later.
And a message to our viewers. Sorry for not asking all your questions. As you have seen, the discussion was quite intense. We will return after a short break in 10 minutes or so, and at 8 a.m. p.m. Sorry, St. Joshua will join us. So see you in 10 minutes, in 20 minutes. Thank you.
or not yet? Mateusz?
Yeah.
We are streaming right now. Right.
Okay, just a minute please for the technical stuff.
Yeah, we have to put the stream on, just to be visible on YouTube. But
Okay, so I think we can get started. A very warm welcome to our very special guest, the world's foremost Lovecraft scholar, St. Yoshi or Joshi, I'm not sure, sorry.
Joshi.
Joshi, yeah, I thought so. Mr. Joshi, we're
Yes.
honored that you're with us, and I'm very excited to hear your presentation. I'm sure all our viewers are, and so without further ado, if you can tell us about Lovecraft philosophy and fiction, we are all ears.
Yeah, you probably know, most of you people out there, that I've been working on Lovecraft for a very long time, really since even my teenage years. And I went to the great institution, Brown University, one of our so-called Ivy League colleges, a very prestigious university. Not because it was a great university, although, I mean, it is, of course, but because all the Lovecraft's papers and manuscripts and things, or many of them, are there. And I was able to do a lot of work on his work there. And in addition to actually editing his texts, I have also tried to do some interpretation of his work, and I thought for many years I've believed that a philosophical interpretation of Lovecraft is a very strong way to go in terms of looking at his work. That's because Lovecraft himself is one of the relatively few creative writers in literary history, so far as I can tell, who has in fact articulated a very complex and detailed worldview, which in my estimation structures his entire literary work. This worldview, which underwent significant modifications over the course of his life, is embodied not so much in a few philosophical essays, but in tens of thousands of his letters, published or unpublished, in which he tirelessly defended or debated points of philosophy and conduct with many colleagues of all different varying temperaments and beliefs. The basic essence of Lovecraft's philosophy is atheistic materialism. He consciously looked back to the ancient materialists, the Greek atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, and also Epicurus, as the pioneers of the world views he espoused. At times he also appealed to French and English philosophers of the 18th century, Voltaire, D'Alembert, Diderot, Hume, and others, but there's little evidence that he was terribly familiar with these particular thinkers. In fact, the foundation of Lovecraft's philosophical view is science. From the age of 8 onward, he exhibited a fascination with the sciences, particularly chemistry and astronomy at an early age, but then later on, physics, geology, paleontology, and many others. He embraced Darwin's theory of evolution, especially as embodied in the work of such philosophers and biologists as Thomas Henry Huxley and Ernst Haeckel, the German writer who wrote a book called The Riddle of the Universe in 1899, which was very influential on his thought. In the 1920s, he was disturbed by the findings of Einstein's theory of relativity, which seemed to undermine many of the principles of 19th century materialism. But in due course of time, he reconciled Einstein as well as Max Planck's quantum theory with a modified materialism that bore some resemblance to the thinking of such philosophers as Bertrand Russell and George Santayana, whose work he did read. I believe, however, that atheism is at the center of his philosophical vision. He maintained that he had become an atheist no later than the age of 12. His reading of Friedrich Nietzsche around 1919 probably cemented his atheism. And in 1932, he explained his attitude in a letter to Robert E. Howard. I certainly can't see any sensible position to assume aside from that of complete skepticism tempered by a leaning toward that which existing evidence makes most probable. All I say is that I think it is damned unlikely that anything like a central cosmic will, a spirit world, or an eternal survival of personality exist. They are the most preposterous and unjustified of all the guesses which have been made about the universe, and I am not enough of a hair-splitter to pretend that I don't regard them as errant and negligible moonshine. Moonshine just being a slang term for nonsense. In theory, I am an agnostic, but pending the appearance of rational evidence, I must be classed practically and provisionally as an atheist. The chances of theism's truth being, to my mind, so microscopically small, I would be a pedant and a hypocrite to call myself anything else. In my view, it was atheism that is the heart of what he referred to as indifferentism, that is, the plain fact that the human race and all earth life are of complete inconsequence to the universe at large, whose immensity, both in space and in time, renders us utterly insignificant. If any of the religions of the earth were true, then humans could appeal to a god as the special objects of his attention and benevolence, and thereby gain some sense of their significance in a boundless cosmos. But there is no god, so this comforting fantasy must be abandoned. We are alone in the universe, with no one to care about our fate. A second ago in cosmic time we did not exist. A second hence we shall have ceased to exist. In his ethics, Lovecraft attempted to evolve a system whereby the meaninglessness of the cosmos and of our place in it is tempered. One method he chose is an appeal to tradition. Lovecraft himself was ardent in his quest for tracing the past in the form of concrete relics of antiquity, whether it be in his own native city of Providence, Rhode Island, which could trace its history back to the 17th century, or to other areas along the eastern seaboard of the United States, whose historical riches he sought out repeatedly in a series of travels conducted with enthusiasm, in spite of his meager financial resources. It is a great shame, of course, that Lovecraft did not get over to Europe and England particularly, because he admired those profound and ancient cultures tremendously. Lovecraft was at times inconsistent in his ethics, however. On occasion, he properly recognized that this appeal to tradition was merely a subjective solution to ward off a sense of cosmic insignificance. On other occasions, he recommended it to everyone. In a poignant utterance, he once wrote, "The past is real. It is all there is." Sounds like a famous quotation by William Faulkner, but Lovecraft obviously involved his independently. The present, in his view, was a thin, intangible line separating the past from an unknowable future. Only the past affords a stable anchor of fixity. At his best, he understood that this devotion to tradition was the only means by which he personally, as an atheist, could gain some semblance of meaning in his life. And here's a quotation. "Religious people seek a mystical identification with a system of hereditary myths, whereas I, who am non-religious, seek a corresponding mystical identification with the only immediate, tangible external reality which my perceptions acknowledge, that is, the continuous stream of folkways around me. I follow this acceptance purely for my own personal pleasure, because I would feel lost in a limitless and impersonal cosmos if I had no way of thinking of myself except as a dissociated and independent point." In his aesthetic thought, Lovecraft put forth an unorthodox division of literature into three parts: romantic, realistic, and imaginative. Lovecraft had great respect for the realism of such writers as Theodore Dreiser or Sinclair Lewis, and as we shall see presently, he advocated a fusion of realism with weird fiction, or rather a manner of writing weird fiction that is fundamentally based on realism. Romanticism, at least as he conceived it, earned his eternal scorn. The one form of literary appeal which I consider absolutely unsound, charlatanic, and valueless, frivolous, insincere, irrelevant, and meaningless, is that mode of handling human events and values and motivations known as romanticism. Dumas, Scott, Stevenson, my God, here is sheer puerility, the concoction of false glamours and enthusiasms and events out of an addled and distorted background which has no relation to anything in the genuine thoughts, feelings, and experiences of evolved and adult mankind. It is possible that one reason for Lovecraft's hostility to Romanticism was that, in the eyes of many, it could easily be confused with imaginative fiction. Lovecraft knew well that the genre had been born in the later 18th century, when such writers as Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe had rebelled from the prevailing rationalism of the age to establish the Gothic novel. As such, he was intent on repudiating any connection between weird fiction and Romanticism, and by the same token, rejecting the notion that supernaturalism in fiction has any relationship to the supernaturalism of orthodox religion. This is another quotation. The real raison d'etre of weird art is to give one a temporary illusion of emancipation from the galling and intolerable tyranny of time, space, change, and natural law. If we can give ourselves, even for a brief moment, the illusory sense of that some law of the ruthless cosmos has been or could be invalidated or defeated, we acquire a certain flush of triumphant emancipation comparable in its comforting power to the opiate dreams of religion. Indeed, religion itself is merely a pompous formalization of fantastic art. Its disadvantage is that it demands an intellectual belief in the impossible, whereas fantastic art does not. Lovecraft tailored his aesthetics, especially his aesthetic of weird fiction, to his atheistic materialism. As early as 1921, he expressed the kernel of this indifferentism and cosmicism. I could not write about ordinary people because I am not in the least interested in them. Without interest, there can be no art. Man's relations to man do not captivate my fancy. It is man's relation to the cosmos, to the unknown, which alone arouses in me the spark of creative imagination. The humanocentric pose is impossible to me, for I cannot acquire the primitive myopia which magnifies the earth and ignores the background. Elsewhere, Lovecraft speculates more broadly on the essential nature of the weird tale. He is keen on contrasting it with other types of writing that might seem superficially similar, such as the tale of psychological aberration. In discussing William Faulkner's great story, A Rose for Emily, a story of necrophilia, he writes, "Manifestly, this is a dark and horrible thing which could happen, whereas the crux of a weird tale is something which could not possibly happen." That formulation might seem a prescription for pure supernaturalism, but note what he says directly afterward. If any unexpected advance of physics, chemistry, or biology were to indicate the possibility of any phenomena related by the weird tale, that particular set of phenomena would cease to be weird in the ultimate sense, because it would become surrounded by a different set of emotions. It would no longer represent imaginative liberation, because it would no longer indicate a suspension or violation of the natural laws against whose universal dominance our fancies rebel. Once again, science takes a central role in the very substance of weird fiction. Lovecraft was one of the most well-read writers of weird fiction in his era, and he understood that he had emerged at a time when many of the standard motifs of supernatural fiction had become ineffective through overuse. But more specifically, these motifs were no longer aesthetically viable because they were based on a fundamentally erroneous view of the cosmos, one chiefly structured by Christian mythology. Now that the fallacies of the Christian worldview were all too apparent, these motifs, among them the vampire, the ghost, the werewolf, the haunted house, and others, were no longer credible. What he says is this: the time has come when the normal revolt against time, space, and matter must assume a form not overtly incompatible with what is known of reality, when it must be gratified by images forming supplements rather than contradictions of the visible and measurable universe. And what, if not a form of non-supernatural cosmic art, is to pacify this sense of revolt as well as gratify the cognate sense of curiosity? In his politics, Lovecraft evolved radically over the course of his lifetime, beginning as an extreme conservative who advocated monarchy and regretted the rebellion of the American colonies from the sway of Great Britain in the 18th century. He gradually came to adopt a moderate, non-Marxist socialism that advocated old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and other elements. It is no coincidence that this revision in his thought occurred soon after the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, when he was able to see at first hand the economic devastation that unregulated capitalism had wrought. In addition, he advocated two further measures that were not adopted at the time. One, a deliberate restriction of working hours for a given person so that all persons who wished to work could find employment. Lovecraft believed this to be necessary because the advance of technology was creating a situation whereby all work could be done by a relatively small number of people. Lovecraft was proven wrong on this point, but it was widely held in its day. The second point is this: the restriction of the vote to those who could pass basic educational and civic tests that ensured that they were capable of making a reasoned choice in the election of officials at every level of government. Something very advisable in the United States, if I may say so. Lovecraft, influenced by Nietzsche's scorn of democracy, came to regard unfettered democracy as little better than mob rule, and believed that it was also hostile to culture because it inculcated a tendency among artists of all stripes to produce work designed for popular consumption rather than work of aesthetic sincerity. In one of the last letters in his life, he spoke keenly on this point. Bourgeois capitalism gave artistic excellence and sincerity a death blow by enthroning cheap amusement value at the expense of that intrinsic excellence which only cultivated, non-acquisitive persons of assumed position can enjoy. The determinate market for written, pictorial, musical, dramatic, decorative, architectural, and other heretofore aesthetic material ceased to be a small circle of truly educated persons, but became a substantially larger circle of mixed origin, numerically dominated by crude, half-educated clods whose systematically perverted ideals prevented them from ever achieving the tastes and perspectives of the gentlefolk whose dress and speech and external manners they so assiduously mimicked. This herd of acquisitive boors brought up from the shop and the counting house a complete set of artificial attitudes, oversimplifications, and mawkish sentimentalities which no sincere art or literature could gratify. And they so outnumbered the remaining educated gentlefolk that most of the purveying agencies became at once reoriented to them. Literature and art lost most of their market, and writing, painting, drama, etc. became engulfed more and more in the domain of amusement enterprises. I'd now like to apply some of these philosophical principles to the interpretation of Lovecraft's fiction. At the outset, we can say that Lovecraft almost entirely eschews any philosophical dualism, the distinction between matter and soul, spirit, or any other tangible substance, even in work that purports to be fiction. His monsters are all material, even if the matter they embody is of an anomalous sort not currently comprehensible to science. The Shunned House, written in 1924, is a landmark in the development of this line of thought. Superficially, this story could be considered a tale of a vampire, but this vampire, whose nebulous body is buried in the foundations of an old house in Providence, does not suck anyone's blood. Instead, it absorbs the life force of successive generations of the house, possessing their minds and driving them mad. The narrator comes to understand that the creature is not, in the strictest sense, supernatural. We were not prepared to deny the possibility of certain unfamiliar and unclassified modifications of vital force and attenuated matter, existing very infrequently in three-dimensional space because of its more intimate connection with other spatial units, yet close enough to the boundary of our own to furnish us occasional manifestations which we, for lack of a proper vantage point, may never hope to understand. Such a thing was surely not a physical or biochemical impossibility in the light of a newer science, which includes the theories of relativity and intra-atomic action. Note the transparent references here to Einstein and Planck. And note also that this vampire is destroyed not by a stake through its heart, but by being doused in a very material substance, hydrochloric acid. Lovecraft's cosmicism is manifested in one of his earliest stories, Dagon, written in 1917. Here we learn that the entity a shipwrecked sailor comes upon when a land mass in the Pacific unexpectedly rises from the sea is a hideous and immense fish-like monster. But this monster is clearly one of an entire legion of entities that may be dwelling at this moment under the sea. At the end of the story, the narrator reflects on the tenuousness of humanity's rulership of the earth. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall descend amidst universal pandemonium. Clearly, this is a story written right in the heart of World War I, just about when the United States was entering that conflict. But aside from Beyond the Wall of Sleep, written in 1919, and a few other tales, the stories of Lovecraft's first decade of fiction writing do not express cosmicism in any depth or detail. Instead, Lovecraft focuses on another theme that emerged from his scientific studies: hereditary degeneration. In several tales, he postulates either the gradual or the immediate devolution of a human being or an entire family. These stories could only have been written by one who had embraced the theory of evolution. In the story Arthur German, the noble British family, the Germans, are discovered to have been tainted by an 18th century ancestor's mating with a curious white ape from Africa. In The Lurking Fear, an aristocratic Dutch family degenerates into a race of mole-like creatures through generations of interbreeding. But the greatest early tale of this sort is The Rats in the Walls, where a single individual reclaiming an ancestral house in England discovers to his horror that in his entire family line, stretching back centuries, was a race of cannibals. His instant devolution from civilized human being to primitive savage is poignantly etched by his successive use of archaic English, Latin, Gaelic, and what Lovecraft calls ape cries. But it was only with The Call of Cthulhu, written in 1926, that Lovecraft brought together the many facets of his philosophical thought into a unified whole. This tale, of course, is a landmark in its exposition of what came to be called the Cthulhu mythos. It is not merely that the creature Lovecraft invented for this tale, the extraterrestrial entity Cthulhu, which had come from the depths of space and become trapped in his stone city R'lyeh when it sank under the waters of the Pacific, is a manifestly material creature, even though it exhibits unusual properties, such as the ability to recombine disparate parts of itself. And it is not only that, as in Dagon, the reader becomes aware of an entire civilization dwelling beneath the waves that could threaten humanity. It is that the true horror of the story is the destruction of the narrator's worldview. He states at one point, "My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wished it still were." And toward the end, the narrator reflects, "What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think." This story was so radical in its conception that it was initially rejected by Weird Tales, the cheap pulp magazine that published the majority of Lovecraft's tales during his lifetime. About a year later, Lovecraft was persuaded to resubmit the story, and this time he laid down a manifesto for his work that still resonates today. Now all my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. To me, there is nothing but puerility in a tale in which the human form and local human passions and conditions and standards are depicted as native to other worlds or other universes. To achieve the essence of real externality, whether of time or space or dimension, one must forget that such things as organic life, good and evil, love and hate, and all such local attributes of a negligible and temporary race called mankind have any existence at all. Only the human scenes and characters must have human qualities. These must be handled with unsparing realism, not catchpenny romanticism. But when we cross the line to the boundless and hideous unknown, the shadow-haunted outside, we must remember to leave our humanity and terrestrialism at the threshold. From this point onward, virtually every one of his tales embodies the principles of cosmic indifferentism that he was expounding in his letters and essays. The Color Out of Space, written in 1927, is a perfect example of what might be called the moral agnosticism that Lovecraft has just enunciated. The entity that is embedded in the meteorite that falls on the property of a New England farmer is utterly inscrutable in its physical properties, but even more so, it is inscrutable in its goals and purposes. It causes widespread devastation, and some remnants of it linger even as it appears to fly back into space at the end of the tale. But it cannot be called evil except insofar as it is harmful to all Earth life. It is impossible to trace any malignity or human motivation, or indeed anything resembling will or motivation at all, in this extraterrestrial entity. And so it constitutes a flawless instance of the disregarding of the principle of good and evil that motivates the great majority of fiction that Lovecraft wrote from a humanocentric perspective. And yet, it might seem a paradox that Lovecraft created all manner of gods in his fiction when he was in fact an atheist. His so-called Cthulhu mythos, a term invented by his disciple August Derleth, a mythology that dominates the stories of the last decade of his life, seemed to envision a universe populated by all-powerful gods who can crush the human race, or at least certain venturesome individuals, at will. How can this be squared with the materialistic atheist of his letters? The matter is quite complex, but some hints can be provided here. These entities are inimical to human beings only because they render our position on this earth highly tenuous and fragile. But they are as much beyond good and evil, as Lovecraft actually states in The Call of Cthulhu, as we ourselves would be from an ant's perspective. Lovecraft's gods are in large part symbols for the inscrutability of the cosmos. Scientific materialist that he was, he knew that the universe held an infinite reservoir of mystery, and even scientific advance could do little to minimize it. As he wrote in a late letter, "The more we learn about the cosmos, the more bewildering does it appear." And at the end, Lovecraft's gods really aren't gods at all. It is true that in The Call of Cthulhu and the Dunwich Horror, various cults are stated as worshipping Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth. But it is also true that throughout his fiction, he postulates the existence of an array of forbidden books, such as the Necronomicon of Abdul al-Hazred, that purport to contain the truth about these gods. But in the end, Lovecraft demythologizes his gods, so that they are revealed as nothing more than aliens from outer space. Incredibly powerful aliens, to be sure, and far greater in both intellect and in their ability to control their environment than human beings. But they are deemed gods only because of the inveterate human tendency to deify those entities and forces whose nature and workings we cannot understand. And in some of his works, Lovecraft states plainly that the Necronomicon and other such works are fundamentally mistaken about the nature of the entities they are discussing. The critical passage comes in the short novel At the Mountains of Madness, written in 1931. where an immense stone city, evidently built by extraterrestrials coming from the depths of space, is discovered by explorers penetrating a previously unknown corner of Antarctica. The things rearing and dwelling in this frightful masonry in the age of dinosaurs were not indeed dinosaurs, but far worse. Mere dinosaurs were new and almost brainless objects, but the builders of the city were wise and old, and had left certain traces in rocks, even then laid down well nigh 1,000 million years. Rocks laid down before the true life of Earth had advanced beyond plastic groups of cells. Rocks laid down before the true life of Earth had existed at all. They were the makers and enslavers of that life, and above all doubt, the originals of the fiendish elder myths, which things like the Pnakotic manuscripts and the Necronomicon affrightedly hint about. So now, the stories about the gods, as found in the Necronomicon, are reduced to myths. The gods are merely space aliens. This appears to have been Lovecraft's conception from the beginning, for even in the Call of Cthulhu, which launched the Cthulhu mythos, Cthulhu and his spawn are extraterrestrials who come from some infinitely far galaxy to the Earth, where they are unwittingly trapped in the underwater city of R'lyeh beneath the Pacific. Cthulhu and R'lyeh rise up in that story, but not because the stars are right, or because of any actions taken by his human cult, but merely by accident, an earthquake, and they sink back under the waves by a similar accident. Lovecraft's underscoring of human insignificance in the cosmos is underscored by his repeated emphasis on the successive waves of alien incursions upon our planet. In nearly every instance, these entities are endowed with physical, mental, and other characteristics superior to our own. They constitute a genuine civilization rather than merely being a random set of hostile creatures. What Lovecraft is saying, therefore, is that even if we were supreme on this planet, the number of alien civilizations that exist throughout the universe makes our achievements seem paltry indeed. This is the burden of a whole series of tales beginning with the Call of Cthulhu, where the mere existence of these extraterrestrial entities is the source of horror. In At the Mountains of Madness, an explorer, when first discovering the old ones, the barrel-shaped entities who had drifted down to our planet from the stars, recalls myths of elder beings supposed to have created all Earth life as jest or mistake. This conception is disturbingly confirmed by the bas-reliefs in the Old One's cities, where a curious variety of primitive vertebrates are seen. These vertebrates, as well as an infinity of other life forms, animal and vegetable, marine, terrestrial, and aerial, were the products of unguided evolution acting on life cells made by the Old Ones, but escaping beyond their radius of attention. They had been suffered to develop unchecked because they had not come in contact with the dominant beings. Bothersome forms, of course, were mechanically exterminated. It interested us to see in some of the very last and most decadent sculptures a shambling primitive mammal, that's us, used sometimes for food and sometimes as an amusing buffoon by the land dwellers, whose vaguely simian and human foreshadowings were unmistakable. This is probably one of the most fiercely cynical and misanthropic utterances ever made. The degradation of humanity can go no further. It is of no particular importance that in Lovecraft's very next story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, an entirely different origin of the human race is supplied, as the character Zadok Allen. No, it's not. Zadok Allen is this old New England man who speaks in this funny dialect. I'll try to imitate it as best I can. Seems that human folks has got a kind of relation to such water beasts, and everything alive come out of the water once and only needs a little change to go back again. Something like that. It's much more severe than that, but you might find it incomprehensible if I tried to do the actual New England dialect. But the guiding principle here is the same: the utter decimation of human self-importance by the attribution of a grotesque or contemptible origin to our species. If the past has suddenly become problematical, the future is no less so. Here we must turn to the prose poem Nyarlathotep, written in 1920, which I see as a virtual parable for the decline of the West. In this tale, we find ourselves in a season of political and social upheaval in which people whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat. And what does the narrator see shadowed on a screen? And I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. The West's decline heralds the decline of the whole planet with the extinction of the sun. Later, the world itself seems to be falling apart. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to show where the tramways had run. And again, we saw a tramcar, lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. People begin milling about irrationally, and when one group filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, I wonder whether we are to read some hint that we have been doomed by our own technology. Nyarlathotep is one of the Lovecraft's most powerful vignettes, and the fact that he dreamed it makes us realize how deeply rooted was his anxiety for civilization. Of the fungi from Yuggoth in The Whisperer in Darkness, it is said, "They could easily conquer the earth, but have not tried so far because they have not needed to. They would rather leave things as they are to save bother. It is not even worth their trouble to destroy us. The hybrid entities of the shadow over Innsmouth feel superiority to humans. They seemed sullenly banded together in some sort of fellowship and understanding, despising the world as if they had access to other and preferable spheres of entity." In The Shadow Out of Time, the narrator comes upon the vast archives of the great race and extraterrestrial species that has conquered the secret of time travel. He writes ominously, "What was hinted in the speech of the post-human entities of the fate of mankind produced such an effect on me that I will not set it down here." It may be wondered why a writer like Lovecraft, so given to the pursuit of truth as revealed by science and so relentless a foe to religious obscurantism, could write weird fiction at all. Some scholars have seen a kind of schizophrenia in his entire outlook, whereby he advocates rationalism in his philosophical thought, but undermines it in his fiction. I believe this is a fundamentally mistaken view. Lovecraft recognized that his temperament was a mixture of seemingly incongruous elements. Quote, "I should describe mine own nature as tripartite, my interests consisting of three parallel and dissociated groups. A, love of the strange and the fantastic. B, love of the abstract truth and of scientific logic. C, love of the ancient and the permanent. Sundry combinations of these three strains will probably account for all my odd tastes and eccentricities." But he sought to reconcile these disparate elements in both his philosophical thought and his creative work. He did so not only by fashioning a body of stories fundamentally based on atheism and materialism, but by using the weird tale as a means of imaginative liberation from what he called the galling limitations of time, space, and natural law. It is precisely because he believed in that natural laws were fixed and irrefutable that he sought the aesthetic escape of weird fiction. But he did so in a manner that was scientifically cogent. "It gives me no kick at all to emulate the idealist or religionist and invent false conditions and significances which actually deny reality. For me, then, is the consciously artificial manipulation of the theogonists and myth-makers' privilege in the manner of the 18th Baron Dunsany," that's the great writer Lord Dunsany. "That is, the deliberate exercise of the human instinct for space, reach, adventure, and cosmic identification through the weaving of fantastic aesthetic suggestions as such, and not as intellectual denials of objective reality. If you get what I mean, I like to supplement rather than contradict reality. I get no kick at all from postulating what isn't so, as religionists and idealists do. My big kick comes from taking reality just as it is, accepting all the limitations of the most orthodox science, and then permitting my symbolizing faculty to build outward from the existing facts, rearing a structure of indefinite promise and possibility, whose topless towers are in no cosmos or dimension penetrable by the contradicting power of the tyrannous and inexorable intellect. But the whole secret of the kick is that I know damn well it isn't so. That final sentence is the key to understanding Lovecraft's entire aesthetic project. The liberation he sought was an exercise of the imagination, not a matter of intellectual assent. But it could only be achieved by a rigid adherence to scientific fact up to the point where the element of cosmic fantasy comes into play. This is why Lovecraft is so intent on maintaining realism in topography, historical background, and other features. As he wrote in his essay, Notes on Writing Weird Fiction, inconceivable events and conditions have a special handicap to overcome, and this can be accomplished only through the maintenance of a careful realism in every phase of the story except that touching on the one given marvel. There's a lot more that could be said about the interplay of philosophy and fiction in Lovecraft, but I hope that these notes will afford some preliminary notes toward that regard. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think I speak for all that when I say that it was very entertaining, said with a lot of passion and quite interesting as well. So thank you. It was really great. And before we ask some questions from the audience, I would like to give a chance to our previous guests to ask you some questions themselves.
Yes, if I may, I definitely want to thank the Mr. Joshi on his beautiful presentation, and I want to comment just a bit before my questions. I want just to comment briefly on Lovecraft's position outside of the literary, mainstream. Let's put it this way. Lovecraft was, for the most part, read in as part of the popular culture, and you, as his major commentator, as well, have been functioning outside of academia. Mm-hmm. And I just want to comment briefly on your enthusiasm about when you talk about Lovecraft. You talk about him with such passion and enthusiasm, with which I never hear anyone in academia talk about any author, any literary author with such passion and enthusiasm. After hearing your talk, I really want to go back and read Lovecraft even more.
Yes.
And this is something that truly amazes me. Your honest fascination with Lovecraft after all these years. Lovecraft really was an incredible writer, but you really do him justice with this approach to his work. My first question to you is on a light note. So I think that I saw a dog in the background of your room.
No, it was I'm not very fond of dogs. Lovecraft was very devoted to cats, and I am, and also there may be a cat running around here. Yes. I'm in the basement of my house in Seattle, Washington, and the cats come and go wherever. We have a couple cats.
So it was a cat. It's not a dog.
I assume it must be. There are no dogs in this house.
Yes, because it would be really funny if the major Lovecraft scholar was a dog person and not a cat person.
As Lovecraft says, I have no problem with dogs, but cats are the most beautiful creatures on this earth.
Interestingly enough, I also have a house full of cats, but they're all tucked in another room, so they don't interrupt. My first serious question regards Lovecraft's relation to Nietzsche. you mentioned Nietzsche briefly, and I personally have never explored this concretely, this question of the relation of Lovecraft to Nietzsche, and I was wondering if you could expand a bit on it. How much Nietzsche did he read, and how influential Nietzsche really was to Lovecraft? Because their views are pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm. I think Lovecraft had a great admiration for Nietzsche. At this time, 1915, 1920, a new edition of Nietzsche in English was being published. Actually, it was published in the United Kingdom, in Scotland, I believe. But those books, of course, got over here. And I think Lovecraft read several of those. We're not absolutely certain which ones he read. But Lovecraft was indeed profoundly influenced by Nietzsche's. Certainly, Nietzsche himself was an atheist. Nietzsche also, as I mentioned in my paper, had a great scorn for democracy, and I think Nietzsche's interpretation of ethics as sort of a naturalistic view of ethics separated from religion. Basically, he postulated the view that ethics was a product of the whole system of morality is a product of the bartering system, and but a purely naturalistic interpretation of how morality came to be, that it has no sanction of from a supernatural deity. That, I think, was also very influential on Lovecraft. Some of Nietzsche's more mystical views, like the whole idea of eternal recurrence, I suspect Lovecraft thought was not scientifically justified, but otherwise, yeah, I think Nietzsche did exercise a great deal of influence. And I think I myself am not an authority on Nietzsche, and I think there's still room to explore that influence more than it has been.
Yes, thank you. And just one more question. What were Lovecraft's thoughts on modernist literature? What was his relation to it? From the little I know, I think that he wasn't a fan, to put it lightly.
No, he was not. Yeah, the modernist literature, that is the literature basically beginning in the 1920s, actually even some earlier. In two branches, of course, there's the poetry movement of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and writers like that, which Lovecraft absolutely despised, because Lovecraft, of course, was very much a traditionalist in poetry. And he wrote he attacked the wasteland of T.S. Eliot in a short piece that he wrote just as that poem came out in 1922. And he wrote a hilarious parody of that poem called Waste Paper. It's very funny, actually, but really gets to the point of what Lovecraft was. In terms of the prose literature, you have writers like D.H. Lawrence and Hemingway, and he didn't care for those either, because he felt that there was no imagination there. And he also just didn't care for their prose. In fact, he memorably referred to Hemingway's prose as machine gun fire, which I think is actually quite accurate. Lovecraft's prose is very rich, even florid to some degree, because he felt that you ought to use all the resources of language to get your points across. Whereas Hemingway, of course, ruthlessly removed any adjectives and other what he believed to be extraneous elements in prose. Was a very stripped down, austere kind of prose, which certainly is effective in its way, but it's certainly not the kind of prose that Lovecraft wanted to write. So, yeah, yet he admired these modernists, especially people like Sinclair Lewis, for the kind of realism that they were bringing. The hostility to sentimentalism, and he felt again that was a kind of repudiation of romanticism. So in that way, he saw eye to eye on them, but on the whole, he did not care for their writing very much.
If I may, just one more quick question. What's your take on New Weird? To what extent do you think that the New Weird of China Miéville and Jeff Vandermeer and such authors does constitute a continuation of Lovecraft's worldview?
I'm not even sure I don't even know what New Weird is, really speaking. I've never understood how different that is from the old Weird, but a lot of this writing, in particular those two writers you mentioned, strike me as very self-conscious, and also does not strike me as it's too literary. It's basically the writer saying, "Look how learned and profound I am." It's kind of I don't know. It does not strike me as being fully sincere. There are some great writers today out there. Caitlin Kiernan, I think, is far and away the best writer of weird fiction today, and she has actually fully acknowledged deeply her debt to Lovecraft and to other weird writers as well. And her work is fully based on science. She herself came out of the scientific world. She was a paleontologist, I believe. And there are certainly other good writers out there, but some of these writers tend to get a little, overly literary, and I don't feel a great emotional resonance in a lot of their work.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Leonardo. Any questions?
Yeah, well, I don't have really a question. Thank you very much, Mr. Yoshi. But I really want you to know that in Chile, I'm from Chile, we have a seminar in Lovecraft that is mostly about your view of Lovecraft. So, your work is amazing for us. It's an inspiration. Also, thank you very much. That's all I can say.
Well, you probably know that I have been spending the last probably more than a decade editing Lovecraft's letters, and we are actually coming close to publishing the complete body of Lovecraft's letters in about 20-25 volumes, all from Campus Press, and it's an enormous. It takes up a whole lot of room on my shelf back there. But I feel that is, one of my great contributions, to get all this material out there so that others can interpret Lovecraft as they wish. It's to get that material out there so that you can have your own views of Lovecraft.
Yeah, you say the best. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have some questions from the chat to read for you. So, they are also from our speakers. The first one is from Levi Bittencourt. He says it was also an awesome presentation, but he asks if in the last 10 to 15 years, we are seeing a plethora of Lovecraftian-related stories in video games, TV shows, movies, books, etc. And although for the most part, they are not direct adaptations, but why do you think Lovecraftian-related content is so popular nowadays? Is there something to do with troubled times or so?
Very difficult question to answer. I think that what has happened is that there's been we call here a snowball effect. This movement has been building for decades, literally. When I first got into this field, if you want to call it that, as I say, this was the early 1970s. I was only a teenager, I was 15 years old or so, just starting to read Lovecraft and become fascinated with him. Lovecraft was only then getting popular in the United States and in Europe as well and elsewhere, but nothing like what it is today. He was still regarded as a very eccentric, peculiar fellow, and didn't really fit into the American or world literature. Very odd sort of person, and rather disreputable in many ways, because he wrote for these cheap pulp magazines, and there's no reason to take him seriously. So when I started my work, again, even as a teenager, I felt that Lovecraft needed, the level of appreciation of Lovecraft needed to be raised. And much as I actually despise the academic arena, and I do, believe me, I do not like that whole realm, and did not want to become a professor, and left the university as soon as I could. It is nonetheless true that professors, especially here and in England, are the ones who determine what gets read in classes, what becomes canonical in literature. And so my goal was to display to these people that Lovecraft is genuine literature, and I believe I succeeded in that. But along the way, Lovecraft's popularity just began to increase, more and more and more. I believe that role-playing game, The Call of Cthulhu, which came out in 1982, initially had a huge role to play in getting Lovecraft even more embedded in popular culture than before. And then we had movies like the Stuart Gordon films, Reanimator, and the others. And all these things just started building one upon the other. So I think that a lot of people who see Cthulhu or something like that may not even be aware that it's actually an invention of Lovecraft. They just know that it's something weird in popular culture that they find interesting. And so everything is sort of built upon itself, and now it's out of control. I mean, I cannot possibly keep up on all the different manifestations of Lovecraft and all the different media. It's fascinating to see.
Yeah, even those small flashy Cthulhus you have somewhere on conventions to sell. Yeah, they are so cute, but I think Lovecraft would hate them somehow.
You'd be astonished, let's just say that much.
Okay, we have another question from our speaker, from Will Bush. Can you talk a bit more about how the studying of Lovecraft in the 1980s was? I'm thinking about your article In Defense of Lovecraft for the Science Fiction Studies in 1980. He asks this.
Yeah, okay, what was going on then? Okay, it was in the later 1970s that the scholarly movement of Lovecraft was just getting going. And again, as somebody said here, it was actually taking place outside the academy, really speaking. I mean, by people who were not associated with universities for the most part. But nevertheless, we were getting our work published in academic disciplines. But there was still a lot of suspicion about Lovecraft in among academic journals and things like that. And that little piece I wrote was actually a letter of comment in the journal. What was the journal? I think it was Extrapolation, or one science fiction scholarly journal, which had basically used Lovecraft, used a book that the fellow was reviewing to attack Lovecraft, and I didn't care for that. There was a lot of that sort of thing going on, and I felt I needed to come to Lovecraft's defense, because I was trying to promote Lovecraft as a major literary figure, and there were many people, of course, who were doubting that he belonged in that class. Over the course of the 1980s, we had a lot of really good work, though, done in both in a magazine that I founded called Lovecraft Studies and elsewhere, and we got a lot of material published either in academic venues or designed for an academic or scholarly audience, and that really did help to raise awareness of Lovecraft. And that movement culminated in 1990, which was, of course, the centennial of his birth, and we had a major academic conference at Brown University in Providence with speakers from around the world. We had scholars from France and Germany and Italy and elsewhere, I believe, coming here, and of course many scholars from the United States. And that was a major event, and I think that was ultimately the capstone of Lovecraft's appreciation in the academic world.
We have another question from Cultist of Chrome on YouTube. Are the dreamlands in Lovecraft's work just parallel universe or something more?
That's a difficult question, because I think Lovecraft's conception of the dreamlands changed over the course of time. Clearly, those dreamland stories are heavily influenced by the work of Lord Dunsany, whom Lovecraft just read in 1919, and was a master of the dream narrative, or the fantasy narrative. And Lovecraft strove to imitate the impression or the atmosphere that he derived from the work of Lord Dunsany. But if you read Dunsany's work carefully enough, you find that he is not postulating necessarily a dream world, except in maybe one or two stories, but a world that is set in some remote antiquity. And Lovecraft initially seemed to follow that conception in some of his earlier stories. But then when he got to writing the short novel, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, that clearly is set in a dreamland. And he postulates there both an individual dreamland, that is to say, a dreamland that each individual comes up with on his own, and a sort of collective dreamland that certain people can enter into, like Randolph Carter in that story. And in the course of that novel, he sort of blends together all his previous dreamland stories and makes them into dreamland stories, which they might not actually have been before. So he was constantly sort of refashioning this particular universe. But then, after writing The Dream Quest of Another Cadet, he really didn't use the dreamland theme anymore, because I believe he felt that realism, scientific realism, was more in line with what he wanted to do. So he put that dream world aside.
Right, thank you. Mateusz, do you have any questions?
Of course, a bunch of
Too many.
Yeah, I think I just have to limit myself to a few. Actually, so the old age question for our viewers. How do you say Cthulhu, Cthulhu, and so on?
All right, yes. You noticed that I said Cthulhu, 2 syllables. Okay, there was a letter he wrote in 1934 in which he specifies the exact pronunciation of this term, using, the phonetic thing, whatever you use, diacritical marks and, whatever. And he says it's 2 syllables. It's not Cthulhu, and the TH is not even a TH. It's a very harsh L sound. So it's basically, his phonetically renders it as KHLUL LOO or something like that. So that first syllable is clue. You have to do it very harshly and gutturally. Possibly Europeans can do it better than Americans, because we don't have that kind of aspirate in our language anymore. But the TH is not a TH, it's an L sound. And you know this because in other stories, he actually renders it more phonetically. Like he actually, in one story that he ghost wrote for somebody else, he spells it out as CLOOLOO, Clulu. And another story he renders as Tulu, TULU. So these are all slightly varying pronunciations, but it gets back to the point that it's not really pronounced the way it looks on the page. So, but he also said that it's not a word meant to be pronounced by human vocal cords. So I guess you could pronounce it any way you want to.
Wow, thank you for
clarifying that out. And another question, and a bit of backstory. I've actually seen a lot of movies that I liked that combined horror and cosmic themes, and I was ignorant of Lovecraft for many years, and then my brother pointed out, these are all inspired by Lovecraft. I was like, who was Lovecraft? And then I really got into him, and to other Lovecraftian movies, and it turns out there's a ton of these. They're being produced practically constantly. And while I was researching this topic, I came upon an interview. It wasn't exactly an interview, but your favorite movie was mentioned, supposedly. So, is it the Last Wave? And if it is, why? Has it changed?
Well, I'll tell you. My favorite movie in terms of the Lovecraft influence, or exactly. That's certainly one of them. I'll tell you though, it's funny. That's the great film by Peter Weir back in 1977, which actually will be a relatively early movie as far as an influence on Lovecraft is concerned. And Peter Weir, I believe, is Australian, is he not? He's a very famous director, and books have been written about him and things like that. But in no book that I can find that I have read has anybody suggested that this film is somehow based on Lovecraft, but it unquestionably is. If you watch that film closely, and especially at the end, I cannot remember the exact scene there, but right at the end, there's an unmistakable influence of the Shadow Out of Time, which in fact was set partially in Australia, so that probably had a lot of meaning to Weir. Unmistakable. There's no way that film could not have been inspired by Lovecraft. It is an extremely powerful film, to be sure. And of course, another great film, only a few years later, that undoubtedly bears a Lovecraft influence is Alien. In fact, I believe I appeared very briefly on a little documentary that appeared a few years ago, or about the 40th anniversary of the release of Alien. And that influence came from two sources. The screenwriter was Dan O'Bannon, who has long been interested in Lovecraft. In fact, he did a Lovecraft adaptation of his own some years later called The Resurrected, which is based on the case of Charles Dexter Ward. He actually wanted to call it The Ancestor, and in fact, he had his own so-called director's cut, which I have seen, which I think is actually superior to the version that was released, but the director's cut has not been released yet, but and may never be. Curiously enough, also, O'Bannon actually wrote the Necronomicon. That is, he wrote a small book. Maybe it was meant to be sort of a commentary on the Necronomicon, but he was fascinated by that conception, and so he actually wrote this little thing. Again, that has not been published yet, but it might be someday. The second influence, the second Lovecraftian element in Alien came, of course, from the great Swiss artist H.R. Giger, who had already by then published one or two books called Necronomicon, and he was the set designer for Alien, and a lot of his sets undoubtedly convey the sort of cosmic menace that you find in Lovecraft. Those two films are fabulous, but I still think my favorite pure Lovecraft adaptation, one that is consciously designed as an adaptation of a given work, is a German film called Die Farbe, The Color, clearly based on The Color Out of Space. A masterful rendition. The director, oddly enough, is Vietnamese. His name is Hoan Vu. Brilliant job. He subsequently wanted to do a Dreamlands film of live action, not animated, and I saw a little clip of it. Apparently he had done a little sort of a trailer, as it were, for it, but I don't think he's gotten the money to actually do this film, so it's sitting around not doing anything. But I would love to see that film come out. But that Die Farbe, to my mind, is far and away the best pure Lovecraft adaptation out there.
Okay, thank you. And since you've mentioned The Color Out of Space, you've probably seen the Nicolas Cage movie. It's supposed to be the start of a trilogy. So what's your opinion on this movie, and how is the trilogy shaping up?
Well, I actually was there at the premiere of this film. It was shown in late October 2019 at the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival in Portland, Oregon, which is just about less than 200 miles south of here, and I go there pretty frequently. And Richard Stanley, the director, was there, and I talked to him briefly. My initial impression was that it was a very powerful film. It had a lot of good stuff in it, but I subsequently felt that he departed a lot from the story, and he admitted that. I mean, he admitted that it was not a faithful adaptation of the story, but I felt that some of his departures were unfortunate and he missed the chance to convey some of the really powerful elements in that story. I think one of the greatest moments in that story is when that old farmer, Nahum Gardner, himself has been affected by the color, and he's basically has this incredible monologue expressing his complete incomprehension as to what has happened to him, and it says cold and wet, but it burns. I mean, it's an unbelievable piece. It's out of Shakespeare, but he didn't do it that way, Richard Stanley. So I thought he missed the chance of doing a adaptation, and I actually regret the fact that his next film is going to be The Dunwich Horror, which I actually don't think is one of Lovecraft's better stories, even though it has a lot of cinematic features in it, which I no doubt was what was in Stanley's mind in wanting to do that work.
Okay, very answers. One more question, please.
Okay, because we have some more on the chat, but
okay, I shut up about that. But I'm on fire, So I've seen Lovecraft Country, the series, and honestly, I didn't much like it, and it made me think, what makes a movie or another work of art Lovecraftian? Do you have some pointers? What to look for?
Well, that's again a difficult question. I think it's more by what you feel than what you can actually define specifically. The of cosmicism certainly is important, but it seems that's actually very difficult to convey on the screen for some reason. I don't. There's not been a lot of success in doing that. I think Alien accomplished that. I think this little-known Lovecraft film that was just called Cthulhu, that came out in 2007, actually was filmed again down in Oregon here, by the shore in Oregon, the ocean. I thought that actually had certain elements of cosmicism that I thought were very powerful. And you know the Die Farbe also did too. But aside from that, you know, there are many different themes in Lovecraft stories. I think this idea of the hereditary degeneration is a good theme that could be adapted pretty well, but I have not seen very many successful films, you know, on say The Lurking Fear. There's a very bad, you know, film of The Lurking Fear. It's just a cheap horror, you know, crude special effects movie. But and there's something called The Unnameable that's very, very bad. But I don't know. I think the idea that the cosmic element can be gotten across by you know, conveying the vastness of creation in terms as compared to our minuscule selves. But the problem is that most films focus on individuals, you know, like a play. I mean, you can't help focusing on human characters. That's what a film is about, and so to get that cosmic perspective in a film is apparently quite difficult.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I guess I have to be satisfied with 4 questions. Let's get back to the questions from the audience. Thank you again.
Okay, I would read the questions, and I will also have one question from myself. But, first one is from Sandra Konopka. After so many years of studying both Lovecraft's works and life, what do you, Mr. Joshi, feel looking up into the sky?
Sky is a fabulous place. I'll tell you, you know, I emphasize Lovecraft's atheism, perhaps because he influenced my own atheism. In fact, I am now, my major undertaking at this moment is a world history of atheism that's going to go several volumes. Probably will take several years to write. I believe this is one of the great issues of our time that we need to explore. I do feel at times the sense of the cosmic in the universe, but of course it's a very hard vision to maintain because we are so trapped in our own little worlds here, and you know, our daily lives are so involved with interactions with people. Even now in the COVID era, or with mundane activities, it's very hard to step back and reflect upon what is out there. I'm in perhaps a better position to do so because I wouldn't say I'm a recluse or a hermit or anything like that. I have a great wife upstairs who tends to me. She's wonderful. But, you know, I do spend a lot of time down here working and thinking. And in addition, I deliberately do not engage in social media of any kind because I feel it just clutters your brain. It prevents you from reflecting upon your situation. It ties you too much to you know, the moment. You need to be able to step back and think about yourself and your position in society and in the world, and where the world is going. And the way to do that is to sort of, you know, not get so involved in the minutia of day-to-day life. And I'm luckily in a position where I can do that.
Oh, sorry. All right. Thank you. We have 3 questions from Meze Adam, or Mezes Adam. I'm sorry, but so he asks, could you talk a little bit about Lovecraft's view of the social? And that's the first question from him.
I'm not sure what that means exactly.
Yeah, maybe. Well, he asks also, is there any indication in Lovecraft's correspondence and non-fiction of a fear that the science-based civilizational stage that he loves could collapse and be overtaken by more primitive stage. Maybe that's...
Yeah, there are some hints of that. I mean, Lovecraft himself was aware, even in his own day, in the 1920s and 1930s, that the advance of science and technology, particularly, was fundamentally altering our society's situation in life, separating us from the past, separating us from the course of life that have people have lived in for thousands and thousands of years, and creating a sort of artificial environment separated from the rhythms of the earth and the seasons and things like that. This is why Lovecraft himself, on a personal level, tried to put that all behind him. I mean, he didn't have a telephone. He lived in rented quarters. His landlady may have had a telephone, but he didn't want one. He didn't have a car and nothing like that. He still wrote in longhand. He hated using the typewriter. Any of these tools of technology were displeasing to him, and he did feel that life was speeding up even in his day, and making it difficult for people to stand back, as I just said, and reflect on themselves. Whether he actually envisioned a collapse of civilization, I'm not entirely sure that's really the case. Perhaps in his more pessimistic moments he might have, but I think he felt that his own society was becoming a kind of barbarism in its own way because of its the seductiveness of technology.
All right, thank you. Also, the same person says, this would rhyme nicely with the, in my opinion, great importance of the Freudian uncanny as a sensation when primitive beliefs, which have been summoned, seem once more to be confirmed.
Yes, I suppose so. I am not fully in agreement with Mr. Freud on the uncanny,
okay.
But I will mention that I don't think Lovecraft ever read that essay because I don't think it was translated in his day, and he couldn't read German. But Lovecraft did take awareness of Freud and felt that Freud again was, as he believed, was a scientist who was, pulling back the sense of illusion that we have been that had clouded our minds, especially through religion. Freud was quite strongly opposed to organized religion, and to that degree, he felt that Freud's theories were a scientific advance. But I'm not sure he fully believed in Freud or fully accepted his positions.
Okay, thank you. If I can ask a question, I'm recalling some modern, also some modern Lovecraft adaptations and some Lovecraftian texts. I'm also recalling some comic books and mangas based on some Lovecraftian motifs, and I think I would ask you, what do you think about those modern versions of Lovecraft and the visions of his text and of his aesthetics that includes some concepts like camp or grotesque? What do you think of that?
Yeah, there's certainly an element of the grotesque in Lovecraft himself. I don't think there's camp. I don't think there's that. There's actually some very shrewd elements of self-parody in Lovecraft. I actually think the story, for example, The Hound, is a hilarious parody of his own type of writing, and maybe The Lurking Fear also. So to that degree, there's some echo there. But I wish I were more familiar with the manga, based on Lovecraft, but I'm not. However, you probably know of the great comic series, the graphic novel Providence by Alan Moore that came out. I was astonished to find that I myself appear as a character in the very last segment of that. It was quite funny, wearing my little trench coat and whatnot. Not entirely sure what I'm doing there, but no matter. I was grateful for that homage. I was briefly in touch with Alan Moore a few years before that, He's also he also despises technology. He doesn't use the internet, doesn't use a computer. You can only write to him by sending a regular letter to him, by mailing the letter, and he writes back to you if he wants to. But when I first got into this field, I scorned a lot of these adaptations because I felt they were not at all true to life or faithful to Lovecraft. But now I think I've tempered my view and say, everybody can interpret Lovecraft the way they want to. I mean, some are maybe more authentic or true to life than others, but it just shows the incredibly wide appeal on many different levels that Lovecraft has, and it's all to the good, I think.
Also, why do you think Lovecraft is really often interpreted by Asian pop culture? What do you think is interesting for Asians in there?
I don't know that work very well, but I'll tell you, Lovecraft's work got translated into Japanese as early as the 1950s. I mean, in books, of course, and many editions of his texts have come out in Japan. In fact, I helped to supervise like a 10-volume edition of Lovecraft, which included his letters and stories and even some essays, maybe even poetry that came out from a major publisher in the mid 1980s. Very prestigious publisher. So Lovecraft became huge even at that time, at least in terms of his texts. We have finally gotten evidence, by the way, that there is Lovecraft in translations in Chinese. Those happened at least by around 2005, and maybe earlier than that, but certainly no later than that. But I think it's just I think the thing about Lovecraft is that he is not tied to his own time and place, as so many other writers are. He consciously made a decision to be sort of more cosmic in that sense, more objective, more timeless, because he dealt with these big issues of where do we stand in the universe? What is out there? He wasn't concerned with personal relations, with class distinctions, and a lot of the other things that were being written at that time. And I think that's why his work can infiltrate many different cultures that don't share American values or European values.
Oh, someone also has similar question in this topic. You have said that Lovecraft was translated to Japanese in 1950s. Is there a chance that he could inspire Godzilla somehow? But I don't know. It's a question from Cultists of Chrome.
Well,
I didn't hear that last part.
Could Lovecraft's translations have inspired Godzilla?
I suppose it's remotely possible, but I doubt it. But I think the Japanese have long had a tradition of that sort of their own. I don't think they needed Lovecraft to inspire them for that. But you never know. I mean, it's possible.
Okay, unless you gentlemen have any last question, we're going to finish now. So, do you? No. I would like to thank you one more time. It really was an honor that you came to our conference and agreed to speak so long and answer all the questions that we had. I hope we can convince you to do this again sometime.
Yes, sure. No,
but not
technology. This is one good thing about technology. It makes this sort of thing much easier. So no, I've had a great time, and I would love to visit your great country someday, a little later, 1 or 2 years down the road, perhaps. There's so much to see, I'm sure.
Okay,
and
we'll do our best to make that possible. It would be great if you could actually come here. So we have to go start with the music shows. You are all invited, of course, and see you soon, I hope. Thank you again.
Okay.
All of you. Goodbye.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Okay.
So this is the end of our English broadcast for today. We have more in store for you tomorrow. A lot of interesting presentations both on Lovecraft and other things. You can check the program, and we also invite you all to